When I walked into the private dining room at Lakeshore Grill that Christmas night, the first thing my sister said was that I was late, but I could still pay the bill. She smiled when she said it. My dad did not correct her. My family laughed. And that was the moment I knew the dinner I rushed to was never meant for me. I was invited only to finish the transaction. The room still carried the warmth of food I never touched. Plates scraped clean, wine glasses half empty, the soft hum of conversations that had ended minutes before I arrived. I stood there in my winter coat, hands stiff from the cold, still smelling faintly like the antiseptic of the clinic where I had worked a double shift. Not one person asked if I was tired. Not one person said they were glad I made it. They only looked at me the way people look at a server who brings the check. Too slowly, I walked toward the single empty chair at the far end of the table. It was always the same seat for me, the one closest to the wall. The one no one chose unless they had no choice. The napkin beside it was still crisply folded, untouched. Even that felt intentional, as if the room had been reset just enough so no one could be accused of forgetting me, even though forgetting me was exactly what they had done. I sat down, letting the weight of the moment settle around me. For years I had told myself it was an oversight whenever I arrived last and found the meal finished. Tonight there was no pretending. The laughter that died the moment I opened the door told the truth more clearly than anyone at that table ever had. This was not an accident. This was a role I had been playing for longer than I wanted to admit. The server approached quietly and set a glass of water in front of me. His eyes flicked across the table and then back to me, as if he had seen enough families to recognize the shape of this one. I nodded a thank you and he stepped away. Dad watched the server retreat, then returned his gaze to his plate, swirling the last of his red wine. He looked tired. He always looked tired these days. Losing Mom 2 years ago had hollowed something in him that never fully filled. Back in. Vanessa took a slow sip of her wine and tapped her nails on the table. She said she hoped I brought the right card this time. The comment sailed across the table with the practiced ease of someone who had been sharpening that line all evening. A few cousins chuckled. My aunt pressed her lips together again. For those of you listening, I wonder what you are doing right now. Some people tell me they listen to these stories while folding laundry or driving home from work. When this moment happened to me, I was still wearing my scrubs and carrying a bag of Christmas cookies I had baked the night before. I would love to hear where you are hearing this. It is strange how sharing moments like these makes them feel a little less lonely. I reached for the leather bill folder sitting boldly at the center of the table. It waited there like a prop in a play they had all rehearsed without me. When I opened it, the total stared back without apology. A number large enough to make a person blush if they were the one ordering. A number large enough to make a person feel small if they were the one expected to pay. But instead of shame rising in me the way it usually did, something new arrived in its place. Stillness. A kind of clarity that felt like cold air on the back of my neck. Vanessa leaned forward as if she wanted to see the moment I accepted my assigned role. The dependable one. The quiet one. The one who carried the weight that made everyone else feel lighter. I watched her for a second. Her smile was confident, but her jaw was tight. Her eyes flickered with something that looked like anticipation mixed with fear. She expected obedience, maybe even needed it. Dad sighed lightly. His fingers drummed the tablecloth. Not in warning, not in support. Just a quiet, familiar sound he made when he wanted everything to stay peaceful, even at the cost of pretending. Growing up, Mom had been the one who noticed when I walked into a room, even when I tried to slip in unnoticed. She was the one who saved a plate for me when I ran late from work. She was the one who insisted Christmas was about presents, not perfection. But since she passed, Vanessa had stepped into the vacuum, and she filled it in a way that made everyone orbit around her expectations. And somehow, without meaning to, I had become the gravity that kept it all from spinning apart. I closed the bill folder and set it gently on the table. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Dad glanced nervously between us. My aunt pretended to check her phone. The server walked by again, and I asked for another glass of water. My voice was calm, almost steady enough to make me wonder where that calm had come from. Maybe years of ignoring the sting had finally built something inside me I could stand on. Vanessa asked if something was wrong. I looked at her and felt my breath slow. I told her that before we handled the bill, We should probably wait for one more guest. The words settled over the table like a quiet thunder. A few cousins exchanged looks. My aunt straightened slightly. Dad frowned in confusion, his brows knitting into the same expression he used when reading paperwork he did not entirely understand. Vanessa blinked, then blinked again. She asked who I meant. I held her gaze. Her confidence flickered. Inside me, the stillness grew sharper, because this Christmas night would not end the way she expected. Not tonight. Not anymore. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint outline of something steady forming in my chest. Not anger, not revenge, recognition. This night had not been set for me to enjoy, but it would not finish the way they planned, not by a long shot. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting that truth settle inside me the way snow settles on a quiet street. No rush, no panic. Just a slow understanding of how many years had led to that single moment. It was not just Vanessa's smirk, or the cleared table, or the bill waiting like a dare. It was the weight of a dozen Christmases before this one. A dozen times I had stepped into rooms where I had learned to make myself small so everyone else could feel big. A dozen times I had told myself it was easier to keep the peace than to ask why I was always the one patching the cracks. I guess the story really started long before that night at Lakeshore Grill. It started in a small tan house on Carillon Drive in Naperville where Dad, Mom, Vanessa, and I built a life that looked steadier from the outside than it ever felt on the inside. Vanessa was the oldest. The one Mom used to joke came out of the womb with a plan. She was already talking about owning multiple businesses by the time she was in high school. I remember her standing in the kitchen one morning, drawing diagrams on a napkin about a chain of wellness centers she swore she would open someday. Mom listened with a soft smile. Dad listened with something closer to hope. I listened because that is what I always did. By the time I was in college, Vanessa was already on her second attempt at launching a consulting firm. She called it a passion project, something she said would let her help small businesses scale. I did not understand half the language she used back then, but she spoke with the kind of certainty that makes everyone else feel foolish for asking questions. Whenever she needed something, she said it quickly, confidently, as if the world simply owed her support, while she built what she believed she was destined to build. I became the steady one without ever choosing it. I took a job as an accountant at a clinic in Aurora after graduating and stayed there for years. It was not glamorous, but it was reliable. I was good with numbers. I showed up early. I stayed late. I learned people's birthdays and kept track of budgets the way other people keep track of recipes. My life was simple but stable, and in a family like mine, stability became a kind of currency. It began quietly, almost innocently. Vanessa once called me on a Wednesday morning saying she needed a short-term loan to bridge a gap until a client payment arrived. It was only a few $100s at that point. I sent it because Dad always said families should not let each other struggle. She thanked me with her usual charm and promised it would be back in my account by the end of the month. It was not. But she had a reason, then another, and then another. The amounts grew slowly, like cracks spreading across glass so gradually that you only notice the damage once the whole pane looks wrong. There was one day I remember clearly. I was at my desk reviewing invoices when Vanessa called, breathless and dramatic, saying she needed a few $1,000s to secure a new partnership. She said this was the turning point, the beginning of her firm becoming something big. I asked for details. She gave me phrases instead of facts, things like strategic positioning and projected revenue and future equity. She spoke the way she always had, with this mix of enthusiasm and urgency that made questioning her feel like doubting her potential. I transferred the money that afternoon. Dad believed her too. He believed her even when Mom raised quiet concerns. Mom had gentler instincts than either of us. She watched more than she spoke. There was a softness in her, a way she could let Vanessa shine without letting it blind her. She told me once that people who talk big often carry heavy shadows behind them. At the time, I did not understand what she meant. I thought ambition was a good thing. I thought believing in your sister was the right thing. But belief and blindness are cousins. And it took me years to learn the difference. After Mom passed, everything shifted. Dad clung harder to the idea that Vanessa was thriving. He needed success from someone, and Vanessa knew how to present herself as the one who could deliver it. She talked about expanding her consulting work into real estate strategy. She said she was advising mid-sized companies across the Midwest. She said she was traveling constantly. There were photos on social media of her in hotel lobbies and airport lounges, and high-floor bars overlooking city skylines. I never saw invoices, never saw contracts. But Dad did not ask for those things. He wanted to believe his oldest daughter was building something beautiful. I kept helping in small ways, and then bigger ones. When Vanessa said she needed help covering rent for her small office in Sinai, downtown Naperville, while a deal was finalized, I paid the landlord directly. When she said she had a speaking engagement canceled at the last minute and needed to reimburse travel costs, I sent another transfer. When she said she wanted to include me as a small stakeholder in her firm and asked for an investment, I wrote a check equal to 6 months of my own savings. I told myself it was not charity. I told myself it was support. I told myself I was doing what Mom would have wanted, though deep down I knew Mom would have asked more questions than I did. There were moments when I felt the strain of it, nights when I sat in my apartment staring at my dwindling bank balance and wondering how I had become the first person everyone called when things went wrong. At the clinic, I managed budgets with precision and boundaries. At home, boundaries felt like betrayal. Even when Vanessa's voice carried that familiar edge of desperation, I still stepped in. I told myself that if I did not do it, Dad would feel disappointed or stressed or worried. I took responsibility for emotions that were not mine to carry, but somehow always ended up in my arms. One Thanksgiving stands out clearly. Vanessa arrived late wearing a designer coat she said was a gift from a client. She breezed into Dad's living room, talking about her latest business trip, using words like portfolio development and investor alignment. And Dad looked at her the way people look at sunsets, full of awe. I brought over a pumpkin pie I had baked early that morning. Dad thanked me distractedly, still listening to Vanessa describe some imaginary lunch meeting she claimed had lasted 3 hours. I remember thinking that my life was ordinary in a way that made me invisible, next to hers. It did not bother me then. Not the way it should have. Year after year, her requests increased. Year after year, Dad's pride in her grew, and year after year I played the same role. Quiet, reliable, and endlessly flexible. When Vanessa struggled with a car payment, I paid it. When she said she needed a temporary assistant, but could not afford payroll, I covered it. When she claimed she was close to landing a contract with a national chain and asked if I could loan her money for professional materials, I agreed without hesitation. I was the one stitching holes in the story she was weaving. The story Dad desperately wanted to believe. But looking back, I can see that every time I said yes, I made it easier for her to expect more. And every time I stayed silent, I taught her that my boundaries could be stepped over without consequence. My silence was comfortable for everyone but me. The truth settled on me slowly over the years. I was the one who kept the family functioning without ever being acknowledged for it. I babysat cousins on holidays. I drove Dad to medical appointments when Vanessa claimed she was out of town. I helped with property taxes after Mom died. I handled everything that required consistency, because consistency was the only thing I had ever trusted to get me through life. I once heard someone say that the person who always shows up eventually becomes the person everyone expects to show up even when they should not. I lived that truth without realizing it. Until Christmas night at Lakeshore Grill, I had not understood how deeply I had taught my family that I would always step in, that I would always absorb the cost, that I would always accept the smallest seat at the table. Sitting in that restaurant with the bill untouched in front of me, I felt the weight of a decade press against my ribs. Vanessa had not blindsided me that night. She had simply walked through a door I had unlocked for her long ago. Dad had not protected me because I had never required him to. And the rest of the family had followed Vanessa's lead because it was easier than questioning the pattern we had all lived with for so long. The hardest part to admit is this: I played a role in creating the very moment that hurt me most. I had not only allowed it, I had prepared the ground for it. And acknowledging that did not break me. It clarified me. I looked around the table one more time and realized something simple and devastating. This Christmas humiliation was not an accident. It was the final echo of every quiet yes I had whispered through the years. And the moment I understood that, something inside me finally shifted toward no. I felt that shift again a few days after Christmas, sitting alone in my apartment with the soft hum of the heater filling the quiet. I kept replaying that dinner in my mind, not just the humiliation, but the parts that did not match the usual pattern. There had been something jittery in Vanessa that night, something sharper than her usual confidence. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the signs had been gathering for months, subtle and strange, like threads coming loose from a sweater you used to think would hold forever. The first sign came one warm afternoon in late summer when we met at a coffee's shop near downtown Naperville. Vanessa swept in wearing a bright blouse and sunglasses, even though we were sitting indoors. She said she had just come from a consulting session with a new client and that everything was happening so fast she barely had time to breathe. She ordered a pricey latte and charged it to her card. When she set her phone on the table, the screen lit up, and I noticed an overdraft alert. It flashed for only a second before going dark, but it was unmistakable. Overdraft protection activated. I felt something pinch inside me, the accountant part of my brain, the part that had been trained to catch discrepancies before they turned into disasters. I waited for her to mention it, but she did not. She launched into a story about a possible deal in Milwaukee. She tossed out phrases that sounded polished but vague, just like every other time she talked about her work. Strategic rebranding, market acceleration, revenue pathways. I nodded along, but my attention kept drifting back to that little red symbol on her phone. It was not the kind of thing that appeared if someone was quietly thriving. I asked her how the business was really going. She smiled too quickly and said everything was fine, but that clients sometimes paid late. Then she changed the subject, asking about my job, my coworkers, anything that would push the attention away from her. She had always been able to redirect conversations with ease, but that day her shifts felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. I chalked it up to stress, but something in me filed that moment away like a receipt I might need later. A few weeks after that, we were at Dad's house helping him sort through old boxes in the garage. It was early fall and the leaves were just starting to turn. Dad had asked us to come over on a Saturday morning to help clear out some of Mom's things. Vanessa arrived almost an hour late, claiming she had a business call that went long. She breezed in with her phone still in her hand and barely said hello before launching into a story about a new partnership she was negotiating. Dad listened with that same hopeful expression he always gave her, the one that made my chest tighten every time. When Dad stepped inside to answer his own phone, I asked Vanessa about the agreement she had mentioned. I was genuinely curious. She shut down instantly. Her shoulders tensed, and she said I would not understand the details. She said she needed positive energy, not skepticism. I had not been skeptical. I had asked one question, but the way she reacted made me feel like I had accused her of something. Before I could respond, she walked off toward the back of the garage, pretending to look for a box she had no interest in. It struck me then that her stories about big deals always appeared when Dad was around but fell apart when the conversation shifted to me. The next sign came in early November. Vanessa asked me to meet her for lunch at a small place near Fox Valley Mall. She talked for nearly 20 minutes about how she was on the verge of scaling her business. Then the server brought the check. Vanessa reached for her wallet, paused and laughed awkwardly. She said she had forgotten she moved some money to another account. She asked if I could cover it and she would pay me back later. It was such a small thing, but the look on her face was not the look of someone who had simply forgotten something. It was the look of someone who had expected the moment to play out a different way. Later that night, I thought about all the times she had asked for help. The requests had changed their tone over the past few months. They were more frequent, more frantic, more hurried. I remembered her calling me in September asking if I could send her a few $1,000 because a vendor had backed out. When I asked for details, she snapped that I should trust her judgment. I sent the money anyway, but the hesitation in me lingered. Something about her voice had been too strained, too brittle, like she was trying to plug holes faster than new ones were forming. One morning in November, I was sitting at Dad's kitchen table helping him review property tax papers when Vanessa called. Dad put her on speakerphone. She sounded upbeat, talking about some new initiative she was part of in Chicago. Dad asked her a simple question about how many employees she currently managed. She hesitated. It was barely a pause, less than a second, but it was a hesitation filled with calculations. She ended up saying she had a small team but did not elaborate. Dad did not notice. I did. That tiny pause unsettled me more than any overdue bill ever had. The moment everything sharpened came a few weeks later. Vanessa and I were standing in the parking lot outside a grocery store. She needed to pick up a few things for Dad. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the notification that appeared on the lock screen. Another overdraft alert. This one mentioned a nearly maxed out credit line. Vanessa turned the screen away so fast she nearly dropped the phone. My stomach tightened. I asked if everything was okay. She snapped that it was fine and that I did not need to pry. Then she launched into a story about a trip she was planning and how everything was falling into place. It felt off the way someone talks when they are trying to distract a child. When she walked ahead of me toward the store entrance, I stayed behind a moment longer, staring at the ground, listening to the traffic roll by on the street. Something was wrong, something deeper than late payments and vague answers. That night lying in bed, I felt a strange unease. I picked up my laptop and typed in the name of her consulting firm into the State Business Registry. I had never done it before. I had never had a reason to. Vanessa had always spoken with such certainty that questioning her felt out of place. But that night I needed clarity. What appeared on the screen made my heart stop. Dissolved. Not active. Closed 8 months earlier. I stared at the words blinking, as if they would change if I looked long enough. I checked again. Same result. I tried different spellings. Nothing. The firm she had been talking about for years, the one she claimed was growing, the one she had taken money from Dad and me to support, was not even registered anymore. It had not been for most of the year. I closed the laptop slowly. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something colder. Recognition. The pieces of the last 6 months began sliding into place. The vague explanations, the overreactions, the abrupt subject changes, the frantic money requests, the overdraft alerts. It all formed the outline of a truth I did not want to face. Still, I did not confront her. I sat with the knowledge quietly, letting it settle the way a heavy snow settles over a yard. Soft at first, then undeniable. I told myself I needed more time, more understanding, more proof. I told myself she would explain everything if I asked the right question. I told myself I should wait until after the holidays to bring it up. But deep down, I knew that Christmas night at Lakeshore Grill had not been about a bill. It had been about control desperation, and the crumbling of a story she had told for far too long. And now I had the first crack in that story sitting quietly in my laptop. Her business was gone, and she never said a word. That truth sat inside me like a quiet flame the night of the Christmas dinner, glowing low and steady while everyone else pretended nothing was wrong. I kept my hands folded loosely in my lap, the bill sitting untouched in front of me, and watched the room move around me as if I were behind glass. Laughter rose, then faded. Forks clinked. Someone mentioned a neighbor's dog ruining their Christmas decorations. Another person joked about how expensive this restaurant must be. All of it drifted past me. My attention stayed fixed on Vanessa, on the way she shifted in her chair every time I looked in her direction. I knew I needed to say something, but not the way they expected. Not anger, not humiliation, not submission either. What I felt was a strange, deliberate calm. It was the kind of calm that comes only after months of truth pressing against the back of your mind until you can no longer pretend it is not there. Vanessa said something sharp about how the server needed to hurry. Dad murmured a tired agreement. My aunt offered a little laugh, thin and obliging. I reached again for my water glass, took a slow sip, then set it down carefully. When I looked up, Vanessa was staring at me with her practiced smile. It never reached her eyes. I leaned back slightly, just enough to give myself room to breathe, then spoke in a tone so casual it made her shoulders stiffen. I said that before we handled the bill. We should probably wait for one more guest. The room stilled. It was subtle at first. A cousin paused mid-sentence. My aunt's fork stopped mid-air. The server passing by slowed just enough to glance at our table. Vanessa blinked rapidly, her smile faltering for the first time that evening. She asked what on earth I meant. Her voice pitched higher, strained at the edges. I kept my gaze steady, unbothered. I repeated myself. I said I thought Jessica would want to be included, since she was such a big part of Vanessa's consulting work. It only seemed fair that she was here for the celebration. The name landed like a pebble tossed into a frozen pond. Everything cracked. Vanessa laughed, but it came out thin and shaky. She said Jessica was busy. She said Jessica was traveling. She said Jessica was running late. She said Jessica was sick. She said everything except the truth. Her excuses piled up so quickly she tripped over them, stitching them together with nervous smiles. Dad frowned. He asked who Jessica was, his tone soft but deeply confused. Vanessa froze again, caught in the briefest moment of panic. She recovered quickly enough to say Jessica was her new partner, her best connection, her biggest supporter, someone she had been working with for almost a year. I let her speak. Every lie she added grew heavier, and when she finished, I nodded once as if acknowledging her story. Before gently setting it down on the table like a card she did not expect me to have. I told her I had looked up her consulting firm recently. I said it calmly, almost politely, as if I were mentioning the weather. I said I had checked the state business registry because I was curious about her growth and wanted to understand how everything fit together. I said that the firm was listed as dissolved, not active, closed nearly a year earlier. The room fell silent. It was not the soft silence from before. It was dense and rigid, the kind that makes your skin prickle because everyone is hearing the same truth at the same time. Vanessa stared at me. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Dad blinked, confusion spreading across his face like a slow shadow. My aunt set down her fork with an almost imperceptible clink. A cousin whispered before quickly going silent again. I kept my voice steady. I said I could not find any filings listing a partner. No person named Jessica. No contracts, no employees, no active consultancy of any kind. I did not raise my voice or accuse her of anything. I did not call her a liar. I simply spoke facts. Facts that had been sitting on public record for months while she spun stories around them like tinsel around an empty frame. Vanessa finally found her voice. She snapped that the registry must be wrong. She said these systems take forever to update. She insisted that her business was thriving and she had plenty of clients. She said the registry did not reflect the reality of her expansion. Her words tumbled over each other louder and faster with each breath. Dad looked between us, his eyes searching Vanessa's face the way someone searches a familiar road they suddenly no longer recognize. He asked if she wanted to explain. His tone was not accusing, but it was not gentle either. It was the voice of a man who had been told one story for a long time and had just learned part of it might not be true. Vanessa shook her head fiercely. She said I was making things up. She said I was jealous. Jealous. The word hit me with a quiet shock. I had never wanted her spotlight. I had never wanted any spotlight. All I had wanted was honesty. And that seemed to be the one thing Vanessa could not afford to give. My aunt looked down at her napkin as if trying to fold herself into it. A cousin cleared his throat. The server paused a few feet away, unsure whether to approach or retreat. Every person at that table sensed that something had shifted permanently, that the usual dance in which Vanessa dazzled and I absorbed the weight had been interrupted. I leaned forward slightly. My voice was soft, but the calm inside it made Vanessa recoil. I told her I was not jealous of anything. I told her I simply checked the registry because something had not felt right. I told her that anyone could search for it, that anyone could see it, that what I found was not hidden. It was not locked. It was simply the truth. Her face changed then. The panic that she had been trying to suppress flickered through her, expression like a light struggling to stay on. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes darted toward Dad, then quickly back to me, then toward the door as if planning an escape route. Dad asked again if she wanted to clarify, but Vanessa shook her head and said, "We should not ruin Christmas with business. Talk." She laughed weakly, begging the room to join her. No one did. The silence stayed where it was unmoved. I sat back and folded my hands. The bill was still in front of me, untouched. But suddenly, it no longer felt like the most important object on the table. The humiliation they had tried to script for me had shifted its weight, sliding slowly, almost elegantly back in the direction it came from. Vanessa licked her lips nervously and insisted she would explain everything. Later. She told Dad not to worry. She said the registry system had glitches. She said the forms were delayed. She said anything to avoid the truth that was sitting between us like a spotlight she could not outrun. For the first time in my life, I watched my sister lose control of a room. She had always known how to bend people toward her version of events, but not tonight. Not after months of cracks she had tried to plaster with charm. Not after I finally spoke words she could not twist. Dad looked at her with a softness that had cracked at the edges. My aunt shifted uncomfortably. My cousins watched in stunned silence. Even the server hesitated a few feet away, sensing the tension radiating from the table like heat off asphalt. Vanessa reached for her wine glass with a trembling hand. She lifted it as if to hide behind the motion. When she took a sip, her fingers shook. She set the glass down too quickly and the stem rattled against the table. I let the silence stretch not out of cruelty but out of clarity. For the first time in a long time, the truth was louder than her voice. It filled the room in a way her stories no longer could. She asked barely above a whisper why I would bring this up now. I told her the truth. I told her I had no intention of bringing it up. I told her I simply thought Jessica should be present since she played such an important role in her business. If, of course, Jessica existed. That was the breaking point. Her face was drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No excuse came. No story appeared. No charm could disguise the emptiness of that name. Jessica had never existed, and now everyone at the table knew it. The moment hung there suspended, quiet, heavy, undeniable. It was the first time I had ever watched Vanessa reach for control and find nothing to hold on to. And in that stillness, I knew something else was coming. Something bigger than any of us were ready for. Her face was drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No excuse came. No story appeared. No charm could disguise the emptiness of that name. For a long moment, the silence at that table felt like a living thing. It stretched across the linen cloth wound around each glass and plate, and settled over everyone like cold air slipping in through an open door. Vanessa stared down at her hands. Dad's brow tightened in a way I had rarely seen. My throat felt tight. Not from anger, but from the weight of something older than this dinner. Something that had started long before my sister's stories began to collapse. I felt Mom around me at that moment. Not in a mystical way, not in a dramatic sense, but in that familiar hush of clarity she always carried. She had been gone for a year, but some truths have long shadows. And I realized that what was unfolding at that table was not the beginning of the story. It was the point when all the pieces finally locked together. The beginning had come much earlier in a quiet hospital room in Aurora, just a few weeks before Mom passed. I had not thought about that moment in a long time. Grief has a way of wrapping memories in cotton, softening them until you almost forget they ever cut you. But Christmas night with Vanessa unraveling in front of Dad pulled that memory out of the fog. Mom had asked me to bring her laptop to the hospice center. She said she needed to update a few things. I sat beside her bed while she typed slowly with fingers that had grown weaker since the last time I had seen her use a keyboard. She paused often to catch her breath, her thin shoulders rising and falling under the blanket. When she was finished, she turned the laptop toward me and told me she wanted me to take care of the family's digital accounts if anything ever happened. She said it gently, like she was passing down a quilt or a recipe. Back then I thought she meant passwords, bills, medical records. The basic things people need to wrap up after someone is gone. I wrote everything down in a small notebook, even though she told me she had already saved it all to a cloud folder labeled family. She said I would understand someday why she gave me access. I remember telling her she did not have to think about any of that. She smiled the kind of smile only mothers have, layered with too many meanings to unpack in the moment. 2 weeks after she passed, I opened the folder on her cloud account to settle utilities and email. Subscriptions. It was the first time I had logged into anything of hers. I sat on the edge of my bed, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of her detergent, and clicked through the list she had organized so neatly. Phone plan, car insurance, property taxes, mortgage history. Then a folder that simply said notes. I almost did not open it. I thought they were grocery lists or reminders. But something nudged me to click. Inside were screenshots. Dozens of them. Screenshots of texts from Vanessa to various people. Notes Mom had written in her soft, cautious handwriting. Images of bank statements Vanessa had shown her. Dates and timestamps from 2021 and 2022. It took me a few minutes to understand what I was looking at. Vanessa had told Mom she was forming a new company. She told her she needed seed money. She told her she had investors lined up. She told her she needed Dad to support her so the business could launch smoothly. There were texts where she outlined what she called an investment pitch, asking Mom to convince Dad to contribute. She claimed she had everything ready except capital. But that was not the part that made my stomach twist. The screenshots showed something else, a different tone in Vanessa's messages. She said things like, "He trusts you more than me and he will listen if you explain it, and you need to help me because this will change everything." There were lines where she suggested wording, telling Mom exactly what to say to Dad so he would not question her too much. There were messages where she talked about setting up her firm quickly so she could use the image of being a founder to get more from potential partners. And there was one message where she wrote, "If they think it is real, it becomes real." I had stared at that one the longest. Mom had labeled each screenshot with a little note. Not accusing, not harsh, just observing. Her handwriting slanted gently across the page. Vanessa asking for investment again. Mentions a partner that does not appear in the registry. Says company will be ready next month but no filings yet. Unclear timeline. Must watch this. It broke something in me to see how carefully Mom had tracked it all. How she had seen the pattern forming before any of us did. How she had watched Vanessa's requests grow and her explanations shrink. There was one note at the bottom of the folder written only a few months before Mom passed. It said, "I worry she is getting in too deep. Quinn may need this someday." At the time, I had not understood the weight of that sentence. I had closed the folder and cried the rest of the night because it felt like Mom was still trying to take care of us even while she was slipping away. I never told Dad about the folder. I never asked Vanessa about the messages. I thought grief was making me too sensitive, too suspicious. I told myself Mom was only being careful. But sitting at that dinner table, watching Vanessa flinch at the mention of Jessica, I realized Mom had not been documenting out of fear. She had been documenting out of love. For Dad, for me, maybe even for Vanessa. She had seen the truth long before the rest of us. She just did not have time to guide us through it. I felt the ache of missing her rise in my throat, but I steadied myself. This was not the moment to fall apart. It was the moment to understand what she had been trying to show me. The pieces slid together like the final turns of a lock. Vanessa's stories were not new. They were not spontaneous. They were not born from sudden panic or recent desperation. They had been forming for years, evolving, shifting, expanding. Mom had seen the shape of it. I had ignored the signs until they were too large to look away from. Dad looked at me, then the confusion in his eyes deepening. He asked softly why I had checked the registry. His voice held no anger, just a tremor of something fragile. Hope, fear, realization. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught for a second. I did not want to destroy the version of Vanessa he had clung to, but I also could not let him sit there believing a story that was falling apart piece by piece in front of him. I told him I checked because something did not add up. I told him about the times Vanessa had changed the subject when I asked simple questions. I did not mention Mom's folder. Not yet. That truth required more time, more space, more gentleness than a tense restaurant table could offer. But I let him see the concern I had carried for months. Vanessa shifted sharply in her seat, her voice rising as she said, "I was digging through her business without permission." She said she had every right to privacy. She said I had betrayed her. She said I was trying to embarrass her. Her words hit the table hard, but no one moved to cushion them. Dad stared at her, then at me, then back at her again. He whispered her name, Vanessa. The way someone whispers a question they are almost afraid to ask. The room felt too quiet, too bright, too expectant. I met his eyes and felt something inside me settle. This was no longer about a bill or a dinner or even a business. This was about the truth finally stepping out of the dark where we had all kept it hidden because facing it felt too painful. The silence stretched again. Dad's hand trembled slightly as he picked up his glass. He did not drink from it. He simply held it as if grounding himself, and for the first time that night, I saw the beginning of a question forming in his eyes. A question he had never allowed himself to ask about his oldest daughter. A question he had avoided for too many years. That question was about to break everything open. Dad's hand was still wrapped around his glass, unmoving. The muscles in his forearm tight, as if he were bracing for a blow he could not yet name. Vanessa kept her eyes fixed on the table, her jaw rigid, the candles flickering in the center of the long white cloth, cast uneven shadows across her face, and in that dim glow she looked smaller somehow, worn thin by the strain of keeping her story upright. But stories have weight, and eventually they collapse under the math of their own inconsistencies. I took a steady breath. If the truth was coming, it needed to be delivered clearly without anger, without commentary. Numbers have a way of steadying a room. They do not shout. They do not accuse. They simply reveal. I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet. It felt heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because of what waited inside it. I had not planned to open it that night. I had hoped the mention of her dissolved business would be enough to prompt honesty or at least an explanation. But Vanessa's trembling and denials had pushed the moment forward, and Dad's unspoken question demanded an answer. Vanessa saw the tablet and flinched. She whispered my name with a warning in it. I ignored it. I tapped the screen, opened the financial reports I had gathered over the past week, and placed the tablet flat on the table where everyone could see. Dad leaned closer. My aunt held her breath. My cousins shifted uncomfortably, unsure where to look. I began with the simplest number. The company accounts for Vanessa's consulting firm. The balance was $712. The last deposit had been nearly a year earlier. The last withdrawal was an auto payment for a vanity website subscription. Vanessa made a small choking sound. She claimed the account was not current. She said she was using another one. She said she had multiple financial structures. But her voice quivered with each excuse, and none of them held up beneath the numbers glowing on the screen. I scrolled to the next page. Her supposed business expenses, gas charges, clothing stores, high-end makeup purchases. Not a single vendor payment. Not a single software fee. No payroll. No subcontractor invoices. Nothing that resembled the operation of a real consulting firm. Dad blinked slowly, his face paling as he read line after line. I moved on. Her personal account. The overdraft protection had been triggered 9 times in the past 4 months. The balance had dipped into the negative more often than it had not. Payments to credit cards were minimal or skipped entirely. A travel charge from a resort in Florida surfaced near the top of the list, followed by purchases from an expensive boutique in Chicago. Vanessa whispered that she could explain. She said the statement was misleading. She said her real money was tied up in pending deals. She said everything except a direct answer. I enlarged one section. A credit card account that had been used to pay for the dinner that night at Lakeshore Grill. The charge was pending and exceeded the card's available limit by a few $100. If I had not stepped in, the card would have been declined. The embarrassment she had planned for me would have fallen on her instead. Dad's breath hitched quietly. His eyes darted from the tablet to Vanessa. I kept going. There was no emotion in my voice now, only the cadence of someone presenting an audit. I was not speaking to wound her. I was speaking because the truth had finally run out of places to hide. I scrolled to a section marked investments. These were transfers Vanessa had requested from Dad over the past 3 years. She had asked for support to scale her firm. She had claimed each step would bring her closer to securing long-term contracts. The total transferred from Dad to her company account over that time was more than $180,000, written out in careful increments that looked harmless individually but devastating as a whole. Dad stared at the number. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. My aunt pressed her hand over her lips. My oldest cousin looked away, his face red with secondhand shame. Vanessa pushed back her chair, her voice high and shaky. She said Dad had believed in her. She said she had not tricked him. She said she had been working tirelessly, and that none of us understood the pressure she faced. Her words scrambled for footing, but the floor had vanished beneath them. I continued. I pointed out that all of Dad's investment money had been withdrawn almost immediately after being deposited. Large cash withdrawals, multiple transfers to her personal account, payments to luxury stores, airline tickets, hotel stays, subscription services with no connection to any business. Dad leaned back in his chair, his face gone gray. His hands trembled on the table. He whispered Vanessa's name again, this time not as a question, but as something closer to grief. She said she was building her image. She said she needed to look successful to become successful. She said businesses require flexibility. She said deals fall through, and she had been working hard to stay afloat. Her voice cracked. I turned the tablet to her finally. I wanted her to look at what we were all seeing. For a moment her eyes flickered down. She stared at the numbers at the overdrafts, at the credit limit breaches, at the charges that had nothing to do with consulting. Then she squeezed her eyes shut and whispered that she wished I had never checked anything. Dad inhaled sharply. It was not anger. It was the sound of a man realizing he had been holding on to a rope that was fraying the entire time. Behind us, the restaurant noise seemed to hush. A server passing by slowed, sensing tension. On another night, I might have cared how our table looked to strangers. Not tonight. Tonight, the only world that existed was the one folding in on itself between the flickering candles. Vanessa reached across the table, suddenly grabbing Dad's hand. She begged him to understand. She said she had meant to pay him back. She said she had been so close so many times. Her words rushed together, tangled with desperation. Dad did not pull away. But he did not hold her hand back either. I went to the final section of my report. It showed her communication history with her credit card company. 3 warnings. 1 final notice. 1 temporary freeze due to missed payments. A payment arrangement offered and not accepted. A new balance transfer attempted and denied. It was the picture of someone not juggling temporary hardship, but spiraling. Dad's gaze moved slowly from the tablet to Vanessa. Something old in his expression broke. Perhaps the idea he had carried for years that she was thriving. Perhaps the belief that she was the daughter who needed only opportunity. Perhaps the hope that his support had been a bridge and not a pit. Everyone at the table stayed silent. You could hear the soft clink of cutlery from another room, the muted hum of conversation from patrons unaware of the collapse unfolding. Next to them, Vanessa let go of Dad's hand and sank back into her chair. Her shoulders curled in. Her mouth trembled as she whispered that she had not wanted it to come to this. She said she had been planning one last deal to fix everything. One last push. One last hope. I looked at the charges on her credit card again. Lakeshore Grill. A luxury Christmas dinner she could not afford. A dinner she had expected me to pay for to buy her more time. That was the truth sitting between us now. The dinner had not been a celebration. It had been a stall. A distraction. A desperate attempt to keep the appearance of success alive for one more night. My humiliation had been the price of her illusion. And she had been prepared to let me bear it without hesitation. Dad rubbed his forehead slowly, his fingers pressing into the lines carved deep over the years. He did not yell. He did not accuse. He simply stared at his oldest daughter with the hollowed-out expression of someone seeing a familiar face through unfamiliar glass. Vanessa whispered that she would make it right. She said she had new opportunities coming. She said she needed just a little more time. Her voice cracked on the last word. No one responded. No one believed her. I shut the tablet gently. The sound of it closing felt final. The silence that followed was thick, cold, and complete. Every person at that table felt it. Every breath was heavy. Every glance was weighted with the truth that had finally surfaced after years of denial. It was Dad who broke the silence. He straightened in his chair slowly, painfully, as if standing against the weight of betrayal. He looked at Vanessa for a long time before turning his eyes toward the middle of the table where the bill folder still sat unopened. Then he looked up again. Everyone followed his gaze. Every eye in the room shifted to Dad. He was the only one who had not spoken yet. And now it was his turn. He sat very still, his hand resting beside the untouched bill folder, his shoulders heavy in a way that made him look smaller than I had ever seen. The soft lights of Lakeshore Grill flickered against the lenses of his glasses, and for a moment, he seemed to be looking through all of us, past the dinner, past the noise, past the stories he had clung to for years. When he finally lifted his gaze to Vanessa, the room held its breath. He said her name quietly. Vanessa. She flinched at the sound of it. He had not raised his voice. He had not shown anger. But there was something in the way he said her name that made every person at that table straighten. It was not authority. It was not disappointing. It was something deeper. Something breaking. Dad asked where his money was. Just that. 5 words. Soft, clear, unavoidable. Vanessa blinked, her mouth opening as if she had a dozen answers lined up behind her teeth. None came out. She closed her mouth again. Her eyes darted to me, then back to him, then down to her hands. She took a breath that trembled at the edges and said she needed him to understand the nature of business. She said deals take time. She said investors sometimes take months to confirm. Her voice picked up speed again, climbing, slipping, sliding. Dad interrupted her gently. That is not what I asked. I asked where my money is. This time the words did not sound like a question. They sounded like the first time a parent sees their child, not as who they hoped they were, but as who they chose to become. Vanessa's throat tightened visibly. She said she could get it back, that she just needed a little more time, that she had opportunities coming, that everything had been building to something important. Dad waited. She said she had not meant to take so much. She said she thought she could fix it before anyone noticed. She said she had been under extreme pressure. She said she did not want to disappoint him. Dad waited. She finally went silent. The truth echoed louder in the quiet than any explanation she could have given. I did not speak. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched Dad try to process the impossible. Math of betrayal. The timeline of spending sat clear in my mind, sharp and even, like a row of tiles clicking one by one. I pulled up the sequence on the tablet again, not to shame her, but because Dad deserved clarity. I slid it closer to him without saying a word. He looked down. There was the first transfer from him to Vanessa nearly 3 years earlier. At the time, she had claimed she needed startup costs for licensing. The money had been withdrawn in cash the next day. There was the second chunk. She had said it was for website development and marketing. It had been used for a trip to Nevada and a luxury hotel in Las Vegas. There were the transfers made after Mom passed. Vanessa had told him the business was expanding and she needed to hire a small team. The funds had gone straight into her personal account, then out again in a flurry of boutique purchases and restaurant charges. Dad stared at the numbers as if reading a language he once understood but had not seen in years. His eyes moved slowly, line by line, each piece settling heavier than the last. Vanessa whispered for him to stop looking. She said he did not understand. She said the numbers were misleading. She said she meant well. She said she had tried. Dad lifted his head. The look he gave her made my chest hurt. He asked again, "Where is my money?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was stark and raw. It was a silence that revealed everything. A silence that left no corner unlit. My aunt looked down at her napkin, unable to meet anyone's eyes. My cousin let out a breath he must have been holding for minutes. Even the distant buzz of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. Dad's jaw tightened. His hand trembled slightly, not with rage, but with something older and deeper. Heartbreak. Vanessa finally said she did not have it. She said the words so quietly they nearly vanished. But the truth never vanishes. Not when spoken aloud. Dad sat back slowly as if absorbing a blow to the chest. He pressed his fingers to his forehead, his eyes closing. When he reopened them, there was no anger there, just loss. I watched him try to gather himself. He looked around the table at the faces of his family. His family had gathered to celebrate Christmas. His family had been pulled unwillingly into the ruins of his daughter's lies. His family had believed in her because he believed in her first. Vanessa reached for his hand again. He pulled gently away. She whispered, "Dad, please." It cracked something in me to hear it, because it sounded like a child pleading, not a grown woman explaining. Dad swallowed hard, then asked when she had planned to tell him. She said nothing. He asked if she had been hoping to fix it before he found out. Still nothing. He asked if he had ever been part of her plan or only her safety net. Vanessa broke at that. She said she had been overwhelmed. She said she had never meant to hurt him. She said she had wanted to make him proud. She said everything except the truth that sat unspoken. She had used him, and she had hoped he would never ask questions. The room went still again. Dad pushed his chair back slowly. He stood with effort, his movements stiff with age and exhaustion. The napkin fell from his lap to the floor without him noticing. He braced himself on the table for a moment. Dad was not a man who shouted. He never had been. When he was angry, he went quiet. When he was hurt, he went quieter. But there was a difference between silence chosen and silence forced by heartbreak. This silence came from a place so deep I felt it in my bones. He looked at Vanessa, then at me, then at the bill folder sitting between us all. He picked it up and placed it gently back on the table, as if returning something fragile. He said he needed air. Vanessa stood quickly reaching toward him, but he stepped back before she could touch him. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it hit her harder than any slap could have. Dad told her he did not want to talk right now. His voice cracked. He said he needed time. He said he had trusted her. He did not say more. Then he turned and walked away from the table. I watched his back as he left the private dining room. His shoulders were bent old in a way I had never seen them. The door closed quietly behind him. Vanessa sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. My aunt whispered something about giving him space. My cousins exchanged helpless glances. No one knew what to do. No one wanted to move first. The truth had finally landed, and it had landed on Dad harder than anyone else. Vanessa lifted her head. Her mascara had smudged her face pale and streaked. She looked at me with a mixture of anger, fear, and something close to resentment. She whispered that I had ruined everything. I did not respond, because what she said was only half true. I had not ruined anything. The truth had ruined her story. All I had done was stop holding it up for her. The room felt too small, too bright, too still. The candles flickered gently, unaware of the devastation on the table below them. Dad's empty chair sat beside Vanessa, the napkins still on the floor. And for the first time in my life, I saw my sister completely, undeniably defeated. The kind of defeat that comes not from someone pushing you down, but from the collapse of the lies you built beneath your own feet. The kind that leaves nothing standing. And as the silence deepened, I felt the whole table brace for what would come next. For a while, no one spoke. The air in the room felt heavy and motionless, like it was holding itself together until someone chose to move. Vanessa's quiet sobs broke now and then, barely audible but jagged, as if each breath scraped against something sharp inside her. My aunt stared at her hands folded neatly in her lap. My cousins exchanged helpless glances. No one seemed to know whether to leave comfort, or simply disappear into the white tablecloth. I stayed still, not frozen, not unsure, just steady in a way I had not felt in years. When Dad walked out of that room, a line had been drawn that no one could pretend not to see. Vanessa finally wiped her cheeks and looked up at me, her eyes red and trembling. She whispered again that I had ruined everything. I held her gaze for a moment but did not answer. There was nothing I could say that would land in a place she was ready to face. Not yet. I reached for the bill folder. Everyone watched my hand move toward it. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. The soft sound of someone waiting for the next blow. I opened the folder, scanned the total, and took out my card. My aunt whispered my name under her breath almost as a question. One of my cousins leaned forward as if to stop me. Vanessa stared in disbelief, confusion sharpening the edges of her features. Even the server who returned hesitated before stepping closer, unsure whether to interrupt. The truth is, I did not pay that bill out of loyalty. I did not pay it out of guilt. And I did not pay it because they expected me to. I paid it because the night had reached a point where chaos would have turned truth into spectacle. The last thing Dad needed, or any of us needed, was a public scene layered on top of a private collapse. So I handed the server my card. He glanced at me with something like sympathy. It was a small moment, but it helped steady me more than I expected. Vanessa whispered that she could pay for it later. Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. She knew it was not true. I knew it too. I told her there was no need. The words came out soft, free of judgment, free of anger. Just final. When the server returned with the receipt, I signed it without hesitation, sliding the pen across the paper in a neat, deliberate motion. The room seemed to exhale. Then the tension shifting again, softer now but still charged. No one asked to stay longer. No one suggested dessert. No one tried to restart conversation or patch the evening together with forced laughter. People stood slowly like they were emerging from a long, disorienting dream. Chairs scraped softly against the polished floor. Coats were lifted from hooks. My cousins murmured quiet goodbyes, the kind that carry confusion rather than warmth. My aunt touched Vanessa's arm gently before stepping away. Vanessa remained seated for a moment longer, staring down at the table as if searching for something she had lost. She finally rose unevenly, her shoulders pulled inward. When she walked past me, she paused as though she might speak. Her mouth parted slightly, then closed again. She left without finishing the thought. I gathered my things, slipping the tablet into my bag. I took a deep breath, then another. The cold outside would feel good on my skin, I told myself, clean, crisp, and honest. When I stepped into the hallway, Dad was standing near the exit of the private dining area. He looked older than he had when we arrived, not by years but by weight. The kind of weight that wraps itself around a man's bones and makes him move. Slower. He looked at me with an expression that held grief, confusion, and something else too. Something like resolve. He asked me quietly if I had the documents from the registry and the financial statements. I nodded. He asked if I could help him review everything properly in the morning. His voice wavered on the word properly. I told him yes. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed out, a long, heavy breath that seemed to deflate him. Then he opened them again and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a gentle touch but grounding. He said he needed help. He said he did not know what to believe anymore. He said he trusted me. The words settled on my chest with a mix of sorrow and responsibility. I told him I would handle it. He nodded once slowly and walked toward the entrance to get his coat. His steps were steady but tired. Outside, the night air cut cold across my face. Snow clung to the ground in thin patches glittering under the street lamps. Dad stood by his car for a moment, watching the parking lot as if trying to piece together how the night had turned into something neither of us could forget. Vanessa was already in her own car, gripping the steering wheel, staring ahead through the windshield. Her profile looked hollow, carved by guilt and fear. She did not look at me when I walked past. I did not expect her to. My aunt and cousins drove off quietly, offering small waves through their windows. There were no cheerful goodbyes, no invitations for the next holiday, no promises about staying in touch. The parking lot emptied one car at a time until it was just Dad and me, standing beneath the glow of the streetlight. He faced me again and asked if I had known everything tonight. I told him no. I told him I had only known enough to recognize something was wrong. He nodded, absorbing that. Then he asked me another question, one that felt heavier than the winter air. He asked how long I had suspected. I hesitated, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I could see how fragile he was at that moment, how much it cost him to acknowledge the possibility that his oldest daughter had not been honest. I told him I had started noticing things a few months ago. He accepted that answer quietly. He then asked if I had any paperwork from past transfers he had made to Vanessa. I said I could gather everything and create a folder for him. He thanked me. His voice cracked again. You could almost see the moment he decided to shift something inside himself. The moment when a parent realizes love cannot fix what truth has revealed. He told me in a low, steady voice that he needed me to take temporary control of the family's financial responsibilities. Bills, accounts, property taxes, medical payments. Everything. I nodded and said of course. It did not feel like a burden. It felt like something Mom would have wanted me to do. Dad then said that Vanessa would need time to explain herself, but she would not be receiving any more financial support until she did. His jaw tightened as he said it, not out of anger but out of necessity. It was the first boundary he had ever placed with her. It was long overdue. We stood there for another minute or two, the cold biting at our breath, before he said he was going home. He got in his car, closed the door slowly, and started the engine. I watched the taillights glow red against the snow as he pulled away. For the first time in my life, Dad looked lonely. I stood alone in the parking lot after he left, letting the quiet settle around me. The world felt still, clean, honest, painful. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt vindicated. But what I felt was a kind of aching clarity. The truth had needed to come out, but it had come with a cost that none of us could avoid. When I finally walked to my own car, the restaurant windows behind me glowed warm with the dinners of strangers. Laughter floated out faintly when the door opened for a moment. People celebrating, unaware that in one private room a family had come undone. I sat in my car and rested my hands on the steering wheel. I took one last look at the dark shape of the restaurant in the mirror. I had paid the bill. Not because it was my role. Not because I was weak. I paid it to end the night before anyone could add one more thing to break. But endings have consequences. And this one had only just begun. Dad had driven away, and the parking lot slowly emptied until the last pair of headlights disappeared into the cold Illinois night. I stayed in my car for a long time, letting the silence settle in my chest, letting the truth of what had happened sink beneath my ribs. I had spent years imagining what it might look like if Vanessa's lies finally came undone. But the reality of it did not feel like vindication. It felt like a slow, heavy loss, not just of money, not just of trust, but of the sister I once believed I had. The next morning began quietly, without drama, without confrontation. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, leaving a thin layer of white across the streets of Naperville. I woke early and made coffee, the house feeling strangely hollow around me. I checked my messages and saw missed calls from my aunt, a few texts from cousins asking if Dad was all right, and one message from Vanessa that simply said, "We need to talk." I did not respond. Not yet. Dad arrived at my house around 9:30 in the morning. When I opened the door, he stepped inside slowly, as if carrying something physically heavy in his hands, even though he was holding nothing at all. His coat was dusted with snow, his glasses slightly fogged from the cold. He looked exhausted. I led him into the kitchen and poured him coffee. He sat at the table in the same spot he always took when he visited, but today he looked unfamiliar sitting there. His shoulders slumped, his eyes unfocused. His hands wrapped around the mug like he needed its warmth more than he needed the coffee. He asked if I had the files ready. I nodded and placed the tablet in front of him. He stared at the screen but did not touch it. After a long pause, he whispered that he had not slept. I told him I understood. He said he could not stop replaying Vanessa's face, not the panic or the excuses, but the years before that. Her childhood, her early ambitions, the pride he once felt when she talked about big plans. He kept asking himself where he had gone wrong. I told him he had not gone wrong. I told him adults make choices, that love does not erase responsibility, that he had trusted because he wanted to believe the best. That trust is not failing. His eyes welled. He blinked it back. We spent the next few hours going through every statement. Not emotionally, just practically, step by step, line by line. He asked questions quietly. I answered gently. The work was meticulous and steady, the way accounting always is. And in a strange way, that steadiness helped both of us breathe. By early afternoon, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. He whispered that he wished Mom were here. My throat tightened at the sound of her name. I told him Mom had seen more than we realized, that she had tried to prepare us without saying the words aloud. He nodded slowly. Then he sagged forward, elbows on the table head in his hands. I reached across and squeezed his arm. It was the only comfort I could offer. Later that day, Dad told me he needed space from Vanessa. He said he could not talk to her until he understood how deep everything went. He asked me again to take over managing his finances for now. I told him I would. He left my house quieter than when he arrived. For the rest of the weekend, the calls and messages from the family kept coming. My aunt wanted updates. One cousin said she felt bad for Vanessa and thought the night had been too harsh. Another cousin said Vanessa deserved everything that happened and more. I did not reply to most of them. Dividing lines were forming, and I could feel the shift happening whether I wanted it to or not. On Sunday morning, Vanessa showed up at my door. She knocked softly at first, then louder. Then she called my name. When I finally opened the door, she stood on the porch, bundled in a coat, her face pale and drawn, mascara-smudged hair pulled back in a messy knot. She looked smaller than usual, deflated almost. She asked if she could come in. I stepped aside. She stood in the middle of my living room, looking around as if she expected the space to judge her. She kept twisting the strap of her purse in her hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said she needed money. I closed my eyes briefly. She said she needed cash fast, that her accounts were frozen or overdrawn, that she had bills due, that her landlord was threatening fees. She had a plan to get everything back on track, but needed a bridge to get there. She asked for $10,000 up front. When I did not answer immediately, she lifted her chin defensively and said I owed her after what I did. Something inside me went very still. I asked her what she meant. She said I humiliated her. She said I blindsided her. She said I had been waiting for the perfect moment to expose her. She said Dad would forgive her if I had not interfered. She said none of this would have happened if I had just minded my own business. Her voice cracked on the word business. I listened without interrupting. It was not anger I felt. It was something more like resignation. The reality of who she was had been clear the night at the restaurant, but now it was undeniable. She thought I was the problem. Not her lies, not the money, not the years of pretending. Me. I told her no. Calmly, clearly, finally she froze. I told her I would not give her $10,000. I told her I would not give her $1. I told her this was not about loyalty or punishment or revenge. It was about truth. And the truth was that she had used Dad. She had used me. She had used anyone she could to support a life she could not afford and never built. She shook her head vigorously. She said she could fix it. She said everyone just needed to trust her again. She begged. Then she threatened. Then she cried. I stayed steady. I told her Mom had once warned me that the truth demands a cost, that standing with it can mean standing alone, that sometimes protecting yourself means losing someone you love. Vanessa wiped her nose with her sleeve. She asked if I wanted to lose her, if that was my goal. I said no. But I would not lose myself to keep her. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were harder, angrier. She said I would regret this. Then she turned and walked out, letting the door close sharply behind her. I sank onto the couch with a long, shaking breath. The house felt unbearably quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when the final thread of something snaps. Over the next few weeks, the division within the family grew sharper. Some relatives called to check on Dad and offered support. Others whispered that I had gone too far. A cousin said Vanessa was heartbroken. An uncle mentioned she was telling people I had betrayed her out of jealousy. It spread fast. Dad stayed distant from everyone except me. He spent most days sorting through paperwork, canceling old accounts, creating new ones, and shaking his head in a dazed kind of grief when he came across another withdrawal he did not recognize. I checked on him daily. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he sat quietly. Sometimes he stared out the window at the snow-covered yard and asked how things had turned out this way. I had no answer for him. Vanessa stopped contacting me entirely. Weeks passed without a word. I heard through the family grapevine that she had moved out of her apartment, then into a smaller one, that she was scrambling for temporary work, that she was telling people Dad had cut her off unfairly, that she was angry, ashamed, desperate. Each update brought a quiet ache to my chest. Losing a sibling is not like flipping a switch. It is slow, uneven, painful in ways you cannot anticipate. But each time I felt that ache, I returned to the truth. The truth my mom had seen. The truth I had uncovered. The truth Dad had faced. The truth Vanessa still refused to acknowledge. She had not just taken money. She had taken trust. Time, years, stability. She had taken the version of herself we believed in and replaced it with something fragile and hollow. I was not the victor in any of this. There were no victors, just consequences. But I had not lost myself, and that mattered. One evening, near the end of January, I sat alone in my house with the lights low and the TV on mute. I looked at the framed photo of Mom on the mantel, the one where she was laughing while holding a pie fresh from the oven. I remembered her telling me once that truth is like cleaning out a wound. It hurts first, then it heals. I was starting to understand what she meant. I did not know if Vanessa and I would ever rebuild anything. I did not know if Dad would ever see her the same way again. I did not know what our family would look like in a year or two. But I knew who I was. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. When I finally turned off the TV and headed upstairs, the house was quiet, still holding the weight of everything that had shifted. But it also held something else. A beginning. Not for Vanessa. Not yet. But for me. Dad was healing and I was healing too. Just not in the way I once imagined healing would look. There were no grand reunions, no dramatic apologies, no sudden moments where everything fit neatly back into place. Instead, there was a slow, steady settling of the air around my life, the sense that the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting. It had been nearly a year since that Christmas night at Lakeshore Grill, and the ripple of that evening still touched almost every part of our family. But the water had grown calmer. Winter had come around again. The snow in Naperville was thick this year, heavier and quieter than the last. I sat in my small home office sorting through a few end-of-year tax documents. For Dad, the radiator humming softly beside me. Outside the neighborhood, kids were building lopsided snowmen, their laughter sharp and bright against the cold air. It felt like a different world from the one I had lived in 12 months. Earlier, Dad called more often these days sometimes to ask about a bill. sometimes just to say good morning. He was steadier, softer. His voice carried more space in it than it used to, as if something had finally uncoiled inside him. He had started attending a small community group for retired parents, the kind that met over coffee and shared stories about their adult children, with equal parts pride and worry. He never mentioned Vanessa there, at least not in the beginning. But as the months went on, he began saying her name again, not with anger and not with disbelief, but with the quiet acceptance that comes when a wound is no longer raw. As for Vanessa, she had moved to a small apartment near Joliet, where rent was lower and acquaintances fewer. I knew she was working part-time for a marketing firm. I knew she was trying to rebuild her life without leaning on Dad's savings or my silence. I knew she was struggling but surviving. And I knew she had stopped expecting anyone to fix things for her. We had not spoken much. A few short messages. A birthday card she mailed that simply said, "Hope you are well." A single voicemail she left for Dad on Father's Day that made him sit in the kitchen and cry quietly for a long time. There had been no full reconciliation. But there had been no further implosions either. Sometimes distance does not mean bitterness. Sometimes distance is the only way love can breathe. I learned that slowly, over months of watching the pieces rearrange themselves into something new. One evening in early December, I was helping Dad sort through the last of the documents he had been too overwhelmed to face during the spring. He sat across from me at his dining table, the same table where he and Mom used to host every Thanksgiving. His glasses were perched low on his nose as he read through a retirement account summary. When he finished, he set it down and looked at me for a long, thoughtful moment. He said he was proud of me. The words reached somewhere deep. I had spent most of my life never needing praise from him. I had been the stable one, the dependable one, the daughter who handled her own life so quietly. No one thought to check if she needed anything. But hearing him say it, after everything that had broken, and everything that had rebuilt itself in small, uneven ways, meant more than I expected. He said he had been wrong to put so much responsibility on me without seeing. He was doing it. He said he should have known Vanessa was struggling long before things fell apart. He said he should have asked questions instead of filling the silence with hope. I told him we all do our best with what we want to believe. He nodded slowly, and for the first time he looked peaceful, saying Vanessa's name, as if he had stopped holding his breath. Later that evening I drove home through the quiet winter roads. Lights glowed softly from the houses and wreaths hung on every door. Christmas music floated from a passing car. I found myself thinking about last Christmas, about the moment Vanessa told me I had ruined everything, and about the way the truth had cracked open the whole foundation we had been standing on. The memory no longer burned. It simply existed. A few days later, as I was decorating my tree, Mom's words came back to me. She had once told me that families do not fall apart because of the truth. They fall apart because people keep pretending. I remember sitting across from her that night years earlier and not fully understanding what she meant. Now I did. The truth had not destroyed us. Pretending hard. Dad pretended Vanessa was succeeding. Vanessa pretended she was not drowning. I pretended my silence kept the peace. And all it did was stretch the wound until it split wide open on a Christmas night none of us would ever forget. As I hung the last ornament on the tree, I realized something else. The biggest change of all had been inside me. For years I had been the default one, the responsible one, the one who paid bills no one thanked me for, the one who fixed what others broke, the one who stayed quiet because it was easier than watching everything catch fire. But speaking the truth that night did not make me cruel. It did not make me vindictive. It made me whole. I lost the version of my sister I once loved. I lost the illusion of what our family was. But I did not lose myself. And I did not lose the chance to build something better from what remained. 1 year after that night, I could finally feel the difference. On Christmas Eve, Dad and I had dinner together at his house. Nothing fancy. No private dining room. No big group. Just the two of us at his kitchen table, eating roasted chicken and mashed potatoes the way Mom used to make them. The house smelled faintly of pine from the tree he had decorated. Soft music played from an old speaker. At one point, he reached for my hand across the table. He squeezed it gently. He said Mom would have been proud of me too. My throat tightened. I nodded. Sometimes words are not needed to say everything. Later that night, After I drove home and settled on my couch with a blanket around my shoulders, I let the quiet fill the room again. Winter air drifted through the cracked window. Snowflakes tapped softly against the glass. I realized something then. Not every family story ends in reunion. Not every wound closes with a hug or forgiveness. Sometimes endings look like smaller gatherings, fewer voices, simpler traditions. Sometimes they look like honesty and boundaries, and the relief of no longer carrying weight that was never yours. I had not won anything that night at Lakeshore Grill. What I gained was clarity. What I kept was myself. What I rebuilt was peace, and that was enough. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.